introduce Cindy DeGrone, our forecast demographer, who is going to go over kind of what we're thinking big picture. And she's going to be tying together a lot of these econ pieces with these population pieces. So Cindy, welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And good morning, all. Is everyone can hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So my goal, as Elizabeth mentioned, over the next 40 minutes is to tie together some of the information we heard this morning and talk about what it means for Colorado's growth moving forward. So in terms of understanding population change, we can think about it in terms of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Nancy did a fantastic job this morning on the estimates, helping us understand the question, what have we learned this past year? In terms of the economist panel that just went, that was a fantastic presentation and answered the question of what do we know about today? As it's been mentioned a couple times so far this morning, the economy and the population are definitely related. And the key that relates the two of them is the labor force. So we're going to talk about the labor force. But today is also where the projections start. And so over the next 40 minutes, we're going to go through the trends of fertility, long-term trends in mortality, and talk about implications for migration. And so what might tomorrow bring? As a quick reminder, our population forecasts are prepared using an economic demographic modeling system, where we start with a cohort component model that adds in births and subtracts deaths, adds in an assumed level of net migration, multiplies times labor force participation rates to derive a labor supply. And then we run an economic forecast at the same time, kind of where we do a forecast of jobs, make an adjustment for those multiple job holders, adjust for commuters, and we arrive at a labor demand. And so at a county level, we then have labor supply and labor demand, and we just want to make sure the two are in line with one another. And so we may make adjustments. But the data that we released on our website this last week is what I consider to be the start of our production year. Because moving forward from here, we're going to continue research, outreach, and continue to get feedback from local governments. Thank you to those of you who worked with our office this past year. Your feedback is invaluable to our process. But what are the takeaways from today's presentation? Absolutely. First one, population growing at a slowing rate. It's been mentioned a couple times. And during the pandemic, we know births were down, deaths were up, and migration was slowing. But as we look at those trends long term, those weren't out of line with the direction we were heading. And then aging, which impacts everything. I would say my biggest takeaway, I hope for everyone today, is to recognize that we're in the middle of a significant transition in our age distribution in Colorado. We're moving to having a much higher share of our population within older age groups, and it's happening rapidly. And so it's going to impact the economy, education, housing, transportation, and public finance, just to name a few. And then in terms of concentrated growth, we know that last decade, 95% of all growth to Colorado landed along the Front Range. As Nancy pointed out, that wasn't the case last year. And that certainly likely had something to do with telework. So we'll share what we've learned this last year in terms of telework. And then increasing racial and ethnic diversity. So population in Colorado and the United States, our youngest residents are our most diverse. And so just by aging, we're going to continue to become more diverse. So a couple points I want to make here are that these trends are also interdependent. So a big part of the reason our population growth is slowing is because we're aging. But yet the slower we grow, the faster we're going to age. And so there definitely depends on one another, and that every county is different. So if we think about each one of these trends as existing along a continuum, every county exists somewhere unique along that continuum. And so today, in addition to talking about the statewide trends, we're going to talk a little about the regional ones as well. But we're going to start out by looking at those slowing growth rates, both Colorado and the United States. This chart begins in 1990 and goes all the way through the end of our forecast in 2050. The blue bars represent Colorado's growth rate, and then the red line is the United States. And we can just see, starting in the 1990s, Colorado's growth rate over 2% every year. There were several years in there where it was over 3%, and that's really fast growth. moving forward on that chart, we see growth rates slowing for both Colorado and the US. We're right about in the middle of the chart, and we see a significant slowdown. That was the result of the pandemic. But then we are expecting an increase. So 2022 net migration, we expect to be higher than 2021. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But then you see we return to this trend of slowing growth. In order to understand where we are, I do think it's always helpful to take a step back and look at Colorado's growth historically. So this chart shows our growth from 1970 to 2021. Each one of the bars represents 1 year period, and they're color coded. So the red part of the bar represents the movers, net migration, so those who moved in minus those who moved out. And the blue part of the bar represents natural increase. And we can see that in the 1970s, Colorado was a really attractive place to move to. Our economy was doing well. It was outperforming the national economy at the time, and the national economy was doing well also. But then we get to the period of the late 1980s, and that was the natural resource bust. And at that time, Colorado's economy was doing worse, far worse than many other states in the country. And so for those who had lost their jobs in Colorado, there were better opportunities elsewhere. And then we moved to the period of the 1990s, incredibly strong growth in the economy in terms of jobs, as well as people for the United States and Colorado. And Colorado outperformed many other states. And so we saw a large number of migrants. And then we get to the period of the early 2000s, that was the tech bust. That was very front range centric. And then I'm often asked the question, where do we see the Great Recession on this chart? And Colorado continued to grow through the entire Great Recession, and in large part due to the fact that we continued to grow jobs throughout the entire Great Recession. And, Patty mentioned it, the professional and business service sector that did really well, healthcare did really well during the same time period that we had big losses in construction. And those were skills mismatches, and there weren't better opportunities in construction elsewhere in the country, so they tended to stay. But more recently, we see that slowing, very slow net migration that we saw in 2021 that Nancy presented. But then when we look at the blue part of the bar, we see a really low natural increase as well. So natural increase, again, it's births minus deaths, much more stable over time as compared to the net migration. But we do see a couple peaks, right? So we had more births following the strong growth in the 70s, and then again following the strong growth in the 90s, because babies tend to follow the migrants. But let me just zoom in really quick to the Front Range, and we can see the Front Range chart looks almost the same as Colorado's as a whole. The majority of the population, of course, of Colorado resides along the Front Range, and so that makes sense. So it's not surprising anyway. But then we see that very continued decline recently. So another thing that's the same in both net migration and natural increase, and even more so in terms of net migration for the Front Range. If we move over to the western slope and the north central mountains, we see the same strong net migration in the 70s and 90s, relatively larger outmigration during the natural resource bust because of the concentration of jobs on the western slope, again, in some of the oil and gas, and outmigration during the Great Recession. Because we didn't see the growth in jobs that the Front Range experienced at the same time in the health services and the professional business services. But we did see a higher level of net migration last year as compared to the last 5 years, so more average. So where the Front Range during the pandemic experienced lower net migration, the western slope and north central mountains net migration continued to be rather similar. If we move over then to the Eastern Plains and Southern Colorado, we see a very different picture. Growth in the 1990s from movers, otherwise overall outmigration with, throughout all the other years, with the exception of the last few years, really the last 5 years, we've seen some more growth to the Eastern Plains and Southern Colorado. And I do want to note that on this chart, I did include Elbert as part of the Eastern Plains. So Elbert is located just east of Colorado Springs with strong to the Front Range in terms of commuting. But really, Elbert developed in the later 1990s, and since this one had some historical on it, I wanted to continue to include it. And Elbert County, so Elizabeth was mentioned in Nancy's presentation as our second fastest growing municipality. So even though Elbert did really well, they're only 40% of that total net migration that the Eastern Plains and Southern Colorado received last year. And a lot of that was in the San Luis Valley and southern areas. But we also see the natural decline, continuing to decline, and new for the region as a whole during the pandemic when we moved into, it was negative. Moved into that negative. We've had counties go negative, but not that region as a whole. So I think now is a good time to transition and talk about those births minus deaths. So in the Front Range, this chart shows births and deaths independent of one another. The solid part of the line is what has already happened, and then the dashed part of the line are our projections. And this is 1970 to 2050. The top line, the births, again, we see three sort of peaks, and the first two following the strong net migration that the Front Range received in the 70s and the 90s, then we see the babies, and a third one coming up, and certainly that one happening for the exact same reason. We are anticipating a higher level of net migration to the Front Range over the next several years. And then in terms of the deaths, we of course see the tragic increase in deaths during the pandemic, but otherwise that number is continuing to increase, and that's a result of our aging. We just have a higher share of population moving into older age groups who are subject to higher mortality. If we look at the difference between these two lines, that's what we call our natural increase. And in terms of growth, historically for the Front Range, it was about 30,000 per year. Moving forward, we see those two lines start to get much closer together, and that's about 15,000 per year. And you can just see how much lower it is in the future. And the same is going to be true for the Western Slope and North Central Mountains. Again, where we see that burst line, the peaks and bursts following strong periods of net migration. But what happened the last 2 years is moved into natural decline, where the deaths were exceeding the births. And certainly through the entire remainder of the forecast period, those two lines are really close together. So much more of the growth to the Western Slope and North Central Mountains will have to be dependent on migration, or those who move in minus those who move out. Same is true for the Eastern Plains and Southern Colorado. Again, moving forward, could see a little natural increase, could see a little natural decline, but certainly no growth moving forward from births minus deaths. It's all going to be dependent on migration. So in terms of migration trends, we know migration to Colorado is driven in large part by job growth, but full-time telework is a question moving forward. So we'll talk about it. But next decade, so I mentioned we're in this unique transition, right? Our migration is going to be influenced not only by job growth, but a need to replace retiring workers. So we'll talk about it. But Colorado's relative unemployment rate compared to other states often corresponds to the level of net migration change. So when we talk about how competitive Colorado is relative to other states in the nation, can give us clues as to what type of migration we're seeing. And so this chart, in particular, it's just an evaluation of net migration. So if you think about Colorado's rank in unemployment, so when we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation, we're getting a larger number of migrants to Colorado. So you can see a couple peaks here, the blue line representing our unemployment rate state ranking. And when was it high? It was high in the 70s, high in the 90s. And high levels of migration during those same time periods. So as we follow this through, what we can see is in 2021, Colorado was not faring as well competitively nationally in terms of our unemployment rate as we were in 2022. So our projection for the 2022 net migration is higher than what we experienced in 2021. And then who are those migrants? This is a chart of net migration by age for the Front Range in particular. And when we talk about migration to Colorado, the majority happening along the Front Range. And so the majority are young. If you think in your head and try and picture a migrant who just moved to Colorado, if you picture somebody between the ages of 25 and 35, you're right most of the time. And then we see the mirror of their children behind them on this chart. And for everyone over the age of 50, we have almost as many move in as move out. And new this last year was a fantastic study completed by the Census Bureau. This data is available at migrationpatterns.org. It was a partnership between the Census Bureau, Opportunity Insights, and Policy Impacts. It was an analysis of covering children born 1984 to 1992 and measured their childhood locations at age 16 and then where they lived as a young adult at age 26. And the big takeaway from the study was that most young adults don't move far from their childhood home. But when they do, the Denver metro area is one of those popular destinations. We were definitely in the top 10. We were actually 7th, tied with San Francisco. But in terms of the data, 71% of children who grew up in Denver stay here. But when we look at our young adults as a whole, everyone aged 26, only 52% grew up here. So the other half moved to Metro Denver from somewhere else. So if we go over to the Western Slope and Central Mountains, however, it is completely different in terms of the age distribution of persons who relocate to the region. A much higher share of net migration is within older age groups and their children. And so we see it here, you're attracting children under the age of 20 for our 20, 21, 22-year-olds. We have just about as many move out of the Western Slope as move into the Western Slope. And then we see a much bigger pickup for young families and retirees. And oftentimes it's the Front Range retirees that relocate over to the Western Slope and Central Mountains. But then if we go over to the Eastern Plains and Southern Colorado, we tend to have almost the exact opposite age distribution as the Front Range, where they experience net out-migration in those young adult age groups and a little bit of in-migration, equal chances across all other age groups. And so this, of course, has been a long-term trend, but we saw a really different number in terms of migration to the region last year that was likely associated with telework. So what have we learned this last year related to telework? The Federal Reserve released a study in terms of the share of work days from home. So pre-pandemic, and this is all workers, 14% of work days were spent working from home. In June of 2022, that number had increased to 25%. So last summer, 25%. They are assuming that this is going to continue to be persistent. And so up to 21% next summer. When we think about it in terms of migration, though, we do want to think about those who could move anywhere and still keep their job. And so pre-pandemic, that number was about 5%. June last summer, 11%. But again, this one is all industries. So we really have to think about the industry specific here as well when we think about this data regionally. And in terms of information, there's 40% of workers are can be full-time telework. Professional and business services and education services were kind of tied there for second, with 20% full-time telework. And so in addition to varying by industry, because industries vary across geographies, we know it's different by geography. And so last year, the American Community Survey released data on your typical commute pattern and those who identified that they typically worked from home. 34% in the Washington, D.C. area, 33% in San Francisco. Denver ranked 8th with 28%, just behind Portland. If we want to look around the state, Fort Collins came in at 21%, Colorado Springs at 18%, Grand Junction 16%, and Pueblo 10%. So, telework definitely changing things across the nation, and in Colorado as well. But one of the things that we know that isn't changing is the fact that we're aging. And so I wanted to share this chart. It's 2022 single year of age across the state. And what we can see here is that Colorado's, our population has been growing. And hopefully you can find yourself somewhere on this chart because it's also color coded by generation. So the silent generation born during World War II and the Depression, and there just weren't very many of them in the light blue. And then following them in the purple are the baby boomers born 1946 to 1964. We see the black line there at age 65 that I wanted to add. But so when we talk a lot about Colorado's aging population, and what we really mean by aging is that we have this much higher share of the population moving into age groups that used to be occupied by a much lower level of the population. And so that's what's causing our rapid aging as we move forward in time. But following the baby boomers, we see the baby bust, what were originally named the baby bust in green, or Generation X. And if this was a chart for the nation, we would see a saddle in terms of the population there. We don't see a saddle. That population got filled in again. We know migrants to Colorado are young, and a lot of that growth happened in the 90s, and the young mobile generation at that time was the Gen X. And so we received a large number. So one of the questions we often are asked in the office is, if we build the infrastructure for this level of population in these older age groups, what's happened after they age out of them? And in Colorado, nothing, because we have plenty of Gen Xers filling in behind them, and then the millennials are going to follow right behind that. And so we see the millennials here in red, currently the largest generation in the United States and in Colorado, followed by Gen Z and then Generation Alpha. So, but as I talked about the fact that we're aging, because we've got these larger levels of population aging into age groups where there used to be a lower one, we have the opposite thing happening on the other end of our age distribution, where we have a smaller number of children aging into, say, your primary education years. And then we've got a smaller number yet aging into middle school. And so as it goes forward like that. And so I wanted to create a chart, or this is one of my favorites, to help explain or highlight that changing age distribution that the state is experiencing right now. So this is the percent of the population under age 18 in the blue line, and then the percent of the population of adults over age 65 in the red line. And we're watching those two change over time. This chart begins in 1990 and it ends in 2050. And from it, we can see that over a quarter of the state's population in 1990 was under the age of 18. So 1 out of 4, while only 1 out of 10 were over the age of 65. And those shares held relatively constant. And we continued to see growth in both the over age 65 as well as the children under age 18 for the next couple of decades. But then starting in 2010, when the first of the baby boomers turned 65, we see these significant shifts. And so the share in the population of the children under age 18 declining rapidly. We're right in the middle of that decline. But then the share of the older adults age 65 and over increasing rapidly. And so this increase and the decline in our share of children really ends by the end of next decade, by 2030. And so when we think about this is our time of change. And this is unique because we're having so much change. Underneath, for those who prefer to look at the data in terms of the total numbers, the blue bars represent the children, the red bars represent the adults age 65. Again, we see growth in both between 1990 and 2020, but moving forward from 2020 to 2050, we see very little growth in the total number of children, and we see a lot of growth in the total number of the population over age 65. And another way to think about this is, we've got much slower growth in the school age. They become our future workers. We're going to need every one of them. Because in terms of the older adults who start to become subject to retirement ages, right, increasing rapidly, and specifically the 75 and over between now and the next 10 years, which are typical ages of retirement. And so thinking about that workforce, just a couple weeks ago, I think the Federal Reserve released a paper on, the labor market may continue to tighten. And they cited recent declines in participation almost entirely due to an increase in retirement. The chart on the right showing the labor force participation rate of persons 55 and over time. And we see that number relatively stable from 2010 up until 2020. And then we saw a really fast decline in 2020. We saw a lot of movement in the labor market in 2020, as most of you recall. But then moving forward, we do see some increases in that participation rate. The question is, how much higher might it go? But for those of us that really watch this data, seeing the share of the population that's aging I would have projected that the labor force participation rate would be right about where it is there at the end of 2022, even without a pandemic. And just due to the fact that we're aging. And so that brings the question, did the pandemic change retirement timing? And the Census Bureau answered this question this last year using the survey of income and program participation data from 2021. So this was a survey, it was conducted in the spring of 2021, and it asked the question, did you or do you plan to retire early of people aged 55 to 70 who were employed in January of 2020? Did you retire early? And only 2.9% said yes. In terms of retiring later, 2.3% said they were going to retire later. And so their conclusion was that retirement trends were remarkably stable during a period of upheaval in the labor market, sort of overall. So to understand some of the changes in that aggregate labor force participation rate of persons 55 and over, it's important to understand both the participation rates by age, but then also how we think they're changing. So this chart on the left is the labor force participation rate projection. The blue line represents 2022, and the red bar is, or the orange bar is 2030. And what we can see from this is we have every single age group for 55 and over expected to increase in terms of their participation. But that also we note that 70% of the population age 55 to 59 participate in the labor force, and only 10% of the population age 75 and over participate in the labor force. And then if we look at the chart on the right, our projected population growth, most of the growth in Colorado's population between now and the end of the decade is expected to happen in our 70 and over population. So putting some really big downward pressure on the labor force participation. And so, we know labor's tight. This is just another sign that it's not going to ease up, that it's going to continue to be tight. And so when we look over the next 5 years, we are expecting 200,000 retirements. So I've looked at a couple different sources of job forecasts, and the job forecasts are not that high over the next 5 years. They're close, but not quite that high. And so almost a double impact if we need to replace the retirees and we need to fill new jobs, we might have twice that number. So, and this is assuming increased participation for everyone over ages 55. So we do think folks are going to continue to work longer, just that aging, we're expecting 200,000 retirements. And then in terms of consumer demand, absolutely that population influences the types of industries that are growing in Colorado. And so we look last decade, our fastest growing age group was 65 and over, and our fastest growing industry was health services. And that makes sense. And so thinking about which industries are growing next decade, certainly important to think about the age distribution of the folks who are spending. In terms of housing, older adults, right? What do we know? We know they tend to own their home and that they age in place. They're our least likely group to move. But then we're going to have demand from new workers as well. And this comes up when I talk to communities about their, age distribution, and are you expecting retirements, and do you think that retiree is going to leave your community when they retire? And most of the time that answer, no, they'll stay in the community. Well, then do you plan on hiring somebody to fill their position once they've retired? And that somebody may need a home as well. And so in thinking about the millennials, also some demand from that side. They're continuing to age into prime, but then also second home ownership age groups. And then Gen Z aging into housing and first-time home buying. The other impact of our aging population is certainly that we are increasing diversity. So the 2020 census, I think, gave us the best picture yet of Colorado's population in terms of the way they identify with race and ethnicity. And so from that census, we know that 45% of our youth population ages 0 to 17 identify as a person of color. where in terms of the population age 65 and over, it's just over 15%. So when we think here, we can think here also about our workforce. So the age groups that are aging into the workforce, much more diverse than the age groups aging out of the workforce. And so we're going to see a large increase in diversity in the workforce moving forward as well. But if we were going to bring all that back together and talk about that long-term forecast, we have to talk about national growth. I think Rich put it really well, where when we were talking about Colorado, he said it's dependent on how the nation does. And I think it's true for the population as well. How quickly the nation grows is certainly going to influence how quickly Colorado grows. We know international immigration to the United States was significantly reduced during the pandemic, but our recent data does show a return to higher levels. In terms of that natural change, or again, our births minus deaths, that's going to continue to drive slowing across the nation. In 2017, 4 states had entered into natural decline. By 2020, that number had doubled to 8, and that was really a pre-pandemic impact. In 2021, certainly intensified by the pandemic, but more than 73% of counties across the United States experienced natural decline. The United States, so I looked at 3 different forecasts for the United States population. All 3 had the U.S. projected to enter natural decline right around 2035. And so if we were to take a peek at how that compares to their historical growth, this is a 100-year picture, right? So the United States population changed by decade, starting in 1950 and ending with the decade, ending with 2050. And the dark bars are what has already happened, and then the lighter blue ones are the projections. And we can see a couple different things. One, the largest growth was in the 1990s for the United States, and that growth is expected to continue to decline. And that's influenced in large parts by natural declines, just our age distribution, having a higher share of the population within higher mortality age groups and a smaller share within childbearing ages. So the U.S. population projected to reach, on average, I averaged all 3, 370 million by 2050, and that's an increase from the 333 million that are in the United States today. And then to compare that with Colorado's growth over those same time period, a couple similarities, right? Our largest growth was also in the 1990s, and our growth is expected to continue to decline as well, also influenced by natural decline. And so it's our expectation that in 2050, we're going to reach 7.5 million residents. So that's an increase of 1.7 million over the next 30 years, as compared to 2.5 million the last 30 years. So definitely slower growth. If we think about Colorado in the context of the nation as a whole, in 1950, we were about 1%, so just under 1% of the U.S. population. By 2000, we were at 1.5. By 2050, I think we're going to be right around 2% of the nation's population. And if we look at that by component, again, we saw the births and the deaths earlier on a chart. So this one beginning in 1970 and ending in 2050, I've just added the net migration. And so if we just focus on those dashed parts to talk about our big assumptions in terms of this forecast. The births moving forward, we are assuming that the fertility rate is going to stabilize, although stabilize below replacement. So remember, we hit all-time low total fertility rates in 2019, and then we did it again in 2020 for the U.S. as a whole, and those were driven by our youngest mothers. So just by the youngest, by us moving some of that through, the youngest mothers kind of reaching a new low, I think the fertility rate's going to stabilize going forward, but stabilize below replacement. And then in terms of that forecast of deaths, it continues to increase just because we have a higher share within older age groups, but life expectancy returns to increase in this forecast. So we know the last 2 years with the pandemic, we saw declines in life expectancy, but thinking it's going to increase moving forward. And with the net migration, we see kind of a big uptick early on in the forecast period. You're right around 2025, absolutely influenced by the retirements and the need for workers to come in and replace them, as well as our outlook for jobs. But we are assuming, again, Colorado remains competitive and continues to attract young adults. So what that growth looks like if we were to put it on a map. Here on the left, projected population change from 2020 to 2050 by county. And we see all red, orange, and yellow counties experiencing growth over this 30-year period, and all of the counties here in blue experiencing decline. So smaller in 2050 than they were in 2020. So we see the majority of that growth expected to occur along the Front Range. That's actually 87%. So if we're talking a total of 1.7 million in the state, we're sitting at about 1.5 million along the Front Range. 12% of that is on the western slope. You can see it kind of concentrated along the I-70 corridor moving out, and then Mesa County, and then as well as La Plata County, where Durango is located, having slightly higher growth as well. But in terms of uncertainties, there are many, and I think that slower national growth is a big uncertainty for Colorado's long-term forecast. Most of our growth is domestic migration. 80% of it comes from elsewhere in the United States in terms of migration. And so how the nation grows is also how Colorado is going to grow. And this question in terms of the competition for laborers, Colorado is somewhat late to the party in terms of aging. We are the 4th youngest state in the nation. We've been aging really fast to try and catch up with everybody else. But these labor shortages are not unique at all to Colorado. And as we saw, our relative housing costs, we're the 4th highest cost state in the nation. And so we have this ability to attract young adults, and San Francisco does too, if we think about that. But in San Francisco, they're able to attract the young adults, but then when the young adults want to buy a home or have a family, they move out right away. And so I think Colorado's ability to attract the young adults is going to continue quite strongly. It's whether or not they're going to be able to make a home here and stay, or if they end up moving out. The other question is, will retirees move out? We've seen absolutely no evidence of retirees not staying and aging in place as they have historically, but it's certainly a potential. If you can take your equity, cash out, and live in a less expensive place, that's a potential there as well. And then the remote workers, will the growth potentially be less concentrated? That's a question. Pandemic uncertainty moving forward, of course, always. And then the automation, as Rich mentioned, also the robotics moving forward. That is a question as well, because if some of the positions, when we think about the open positions from folks retiring, the 200,000, how many of those will actually need to be replaced? Will there be some opportunity for automation of some of those positions? So that could potentially change things moving forward. And then the water and natural disasters that has certainly been a theme. But at this time, I would love to invite Elizabeth and Nancy back up, because I think we'll have the opportunity to answer some questions. So thank you.